All right, Max, thanks so much for joining me. It's really nice to meet you. I appreciate you joining the Mark Divine Show.
Marky Mark, it's good to be here. It's an honor.
Dude, so I have a passion for nutrition as well. I'm a little bit more broad in my focus, but I noticed, so we were mentioning just a little while ago that we actually have some investments in common. And, I want to get into that. We can kind of start there because a lot of people who start to really pay attention to nutrition, they want to know about like what specific brands to eat or what supplements to take. And there's a lot of noise out there and there's a lot of crap. But there's some really, really, really good products that are coming along that kind of pass the is it good for you test? Is it made with really good ingredients test? Is it non-GMO and all that kind of good stuff? One of my sponsors is started or founded by a good friend of mine named Rob Wolf, who was one of the early pioneers in the paleo movement. And you mentioned you haven't met Rob, but you invested in his company Element, as did I. And let me just start there. What's your take on hydration and the need for salt in our body? Because most people think, like my dad's generation, salt was evil. You know what I mean? Like because of hypertension and all that. So most people don't think that putting salt in your body is a good thing. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, I'd love to. It's a great place to start. Salt has been demonized over the past couple of decades because of its association with hypertension, so high blood pressure.
Right.
And the reality is that most Americans already consume more than enough sodium, but that's because 60% of the calories that most Americans are consuming come from what are called ultra-processed foods. So these are
Right.
foods that are usually packed with sodium along with other additives to increase shelf life, to make these foods hyper palatable.
Mm-hmm.
Typically because the foods are not fresh foods. So in fresh food, you have what are
Right.
called volatile organic compounds, among other chemicals in food, that are responsible for flavor. And when you're trying to make
Right.
a food shelf stable, you lose the potency of some of those compounds. And so what you'll often find is manufacturers adding all kinds of oils and sugar, salt to these products.
Interesting.
But 11% of the sodium that Americans consume on a daily basis actually come from home cooking, come from their salt shakers. So the vast majority, as I mentioned, come from restaurants, fast food, canned foods, processed, packaged foods, and things like that. So once you start to, and it should also go without saying that the average American's health is not, let's just say, idyllic. 9 in 10 adults have
We're
some,
not talking about elite athlete needing to
no.
supplement with,
Exactly. Your average American
electrolytes.
today has at least one component of metabolic syndrome. 9 in 10 adults have some degree of metabolic illness. 2/3 of adults are either overweight or obese. By the year 2030, in fact, 1 in 2 adults are going to be not just overweight but obese, and half
Are
of
you
us have.
serious? I mean, that's the
Yeah,
trend. You don't
that's
see
the
it
trend.
turning around with all the work that you're doing and others are doing.
No, I mean we're still talking to. I mean, unfortunately, the masses are still out
Right.
there confused. We could talk about food access, but generally, I think it's a problem of information just not getting out to the appropriate people, right? Like we put out information to massive audiences, thankfully, but these are audiences that are already kind of like tapped into the notion that food can affect health. But I still
Yeah,
think that
I agree.
well,
It's also not to get into the social justice aspects, but it's a problem of access and poverty, really. And I would
yeah,
say that even middle class have been, because of inflation and just the parity of the dollar, have been pushed into poverty. So they're looking to eat at cheap fast food places, which are serving up the crap, or
right.
they're
And
buying,
sugar,
that packaged stuff. Right.
100%. Sugar is incredibly cheap thanks to government subsidies that support
Right.
the agriculture of corn agriculture, that most of which ends up going to support factory farms and or produce high fructose corn syrup and corn oil, which our diets
Right.
are now saturated in. There's a lot of confusion, I think, now with regard to the place of animal products, which I'm a big advocate for the consumption of in a
Hmm.
healthy diet. A lot of people are a lot of companies are now pushing consumers toward plant-based diets, but it's not like
Hmm.
consumers are ending up eating more salads or fibrous vegetables. They end up eating more of these ultra processed meat substitutes, right? So
Right.
there are a lot of conflicts of interest, I think, in
Hmm.
the landscape that are influencing people's decisions at mealtime. But generally, yeah. So I think the average person's health is not ideal. And then once we try to improve our health, we cut out the packaged processed foods because we know that these ultra processed foods are really at the foundation of the obesity epidemic.
Hmm.
And that's when people start to require sodium, ingesting
Right.
sodium, right? Sodium is a macro mineral. We require a relatively large amount of it for good health. And so once you start cutting out those kinds of foods, well, where are you getting your sodium from? Particularly if you are exercising regularly or if you're sweating
Yeah.
regularly
Right.
via saunas and such.
What's the problem if you don't? Let's say you are a moderately vigorous athlete. Go to the CrossFit gym a couple times a week, or you're a runner or biker, or doing your Peloton, and you believe the myth that salt was bad. What will happen to you? What's the issue if you're under, um, whatever you call it? You're not getting enough of the sodium.
Yeah, so I mean, hyponatremia is what could result, which can cause, fainting. You can develop symptoms that would seem like dementia, actually.
Is that
Um,
drinking too much water, or is that too?
yeah, so either way, either you drink too much water and you're depleting your body of electrolytes, or
Yeah.
simply you don't consume enough electrolytes. Those are sort of the
Either
two.
way, huh? It's still hyponatremia. Interesting.
Yeah, those are the two primary routes that
What does
that
sodium do for us? It helps us.
it
It
helps
helps us.
maintain healthy blood volume primarily.
Yeah.
So it helps
Right.
maintain blood flow. It helps with nerve signal transduction.
Right.
Um, I believe it
It,
helps vitamin C enter the brain. It's really important. Without it, you would die. It's a macro mineral.
yeah. So it's got a lot of impact on our brain health and our cognition probably as well.
It does, yeah. Especially for older adults that underconsume sodium. Um, it can have a negative impact on cognitive function. People who also adopt low carbohydrate diets
Hmm.
need to again think about where their sodium is coming from because insulin helps to maintain sodium levels in the body. And on
Hmm.
just one day of a low carbohydrate diet, the amount of insulin secreted by your pancreas is cut in half. And so
Huh.
that can cause a spilling of sodium essentially. And that's one of the reasons why I think many people who um, cold turkey adopt a low carb and particularly a ketogenic diet will experience what's called the low carb flu. I know a
Right.
lot of people. I'm not a clinician, so I put out work out for the masses, and I get feedback via emails and DMs on social media. And what I've seen is that a lot of people who have taken the advice to add more sodium to the diet when adopting a lower carbohydrate diet seem to make that transition much more smoothly.
Hmm. That's interesting. I want to come back to keto versus a moderately carbohydrate diet, because I know that I saw that in some of your work that you really promote protein, and you made a comment earlier that meat is good for you, and I don't disagree. I mean, there may be some people that it's not, but before we go there, I want to just get into like Max yourself. Like, you grew up in New York City. How did you get interested in nutrition to where, now you're spending probably every waking hour consumed with it and thinking about it and writing books about it and podcasting about it?
Yeah, I'm obsessed with it, and I've actually been for as long as I can remember.
Yeah.
I became interested when I was in high school. I was a computer programmer. I was kind of nerdy. I had terrible hair, braces, and I
I,
discovered.
I'm just doing the pic overlay on your face now, and I actually can see it. I mean, you're kind of well put together, handsome guy, but I could do the retro nerdy
Well,
glasses,
yeah, the
pimples,
hair
bad
was
hair.
it was pushed back. I had braces. I don't have a small nose. Let's just put it that way. I kind of looked like I'm not even kidding you. I kind of looked like Butthead in Beavis and Butthead when I was in high school.
You kind
It's
of look like Mark Zuckerberg's older brother right now,
oh
a more
god,
handsome version of Zuck. Sorry about that.
wow. Maybe it's the lighting. I don't know. I've never gotten that before, but needless to say, in high school, my confidence was not very high. I was kind of introverted. I was shy around girls, and I discovered bodybuilding.
Okay.
And I never intended on being being a bodybuilder, but I became really interested in the science underpinning um, the the endeavor that is bodybuilding. And
Yeah.
I gravitated to fitness forums, and I became really interested in supplementation and diets and nutrition and fitness, and I started to work out, and I saw a radical shift in my mental health. I saw a radical shift in my body composition, my confidence, everything improved. It was the rising tide that lifted all the boats
That's awesome. Yeah.
in my harbor. And so that was like that was something that I became really, really passionate about. And the way that my brain works, my brain is kind of like a light switch. Either I'm obsessed with something or I'm not interested in it.
It's exactly like my son. I don't think
Oh,
it's uncommon, but it must be a personality type
I
because
love
he
that.
doesn't do anything that he's not passionate about. And he's passionate about cars. So 80, 90% of his time is spent focused on cars.
I
You're
love that.
nutrition, he's cars.
Yeah.
Anyways, just
Well,
wanted to point
that's
that out.
why. So I actually started college on a pre med track. But even though I was obsessively interested in health science, I wasn't able to get good grades in the non science related
Well,
classes.
because you're not passionate about sickness, you're passionate about health.
There you go.
Medical profession is all about sickness.
Yeah, 100%. It's sick care. So I ended up pivoting out of that and going into journalism. And I did that. I became a journalist in the US, working on TV in 100 million homes for about 6 years.
That was with Al Gore's thing,
Yeah, it was with Al Gore's thing.
current
I was
network.
just like a college graduate. I had this amazing job opportunity. I seized it, and I did that. I learned a lot, and that about 6 years in, it was then in my personal life that my mother started to show the earliest symptoms of what would ultimately be diagnosed as a form of dementia called Lewy body dementia.
Okay.
And that was when things kind of came full circle for me, and it was a point of no return where I remember we were in Cleveland, Ohio. I had just taken my mom. We just left a doctor's office actually at the Cleveland Clinic, which is a hospital known for taking on very complex medical cases. And it was there that my mom, for the first time, was prescribed drugs for both Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease.
Okay.
And that was really the moment in my life that I became obsessed with trying to understand, to the best of my ability, everything that I possibly could about the etiology of neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia. And
Hmm.
in tandem with that, I wanted to understand if there was anything that could be done to help her, as well as prevent it from ever being able to take a foothold in my own brain, what it
Right.
was that my mom had developed. And so that's like my mom is my why. She passed away 3 years ago, but all of my work is dedicated to her, and it's really set me down on the path of this relentless pursuit of truth, which will probably continue until my last breath, trying to understand
Right.
why my mom's health was so tragic.
And what did you discover that could help your mom, and what did you discover that was just there's just no hope because nutrition wasn't the answer?
Yeah. Well, I discovered that Alzheimer's disease, like most chronic non-communicable conditions, begin in the brain years, if not decades, before the first symptom.
Right.
So, Alzheimer's disease, by all accounts, begins in the brain at least 20 years, 20 to 30 years before the first symptom.
It's a lifestyle disease, right?
Yeah, it is. It's something that takes a long time to manifest. It doesn't occur overnight. And this is true for all of the kinds of conditions that are now we're seeing really take a like bury its claws into modern society. 60% of the deaths now worldwide occur due to these kinds of chronic non-communicable conditions. Parkinson's disease is another example of a condition where by the time you show up to your neurologist's office, half of the neurons involved in movement in the substantia nigra region of the brain are already dead.
Wow.
So, and my mom had a condition, as I mentioned, called Lewy body dementia, which is sort of like having both Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease at the same time.
Wow.
So for me, it became very clear that this is something that we really need to talk about in the context of prevention.
Right.
Because once you already have the condition, there's just so much pathology in the brain that it's really hard to change course at that point. And there is good research coming out with regard to the ketogenic diet, certain ketogenic fats um, that seem hopeful. But Alzheimer's drug trials have a abysmal success rate. 99.6% of Alzheimer's drug trials fail.
Really?
And
Wow.
so for me, it became very much about prevention and about adopting the kind of dietary pattern that I was reading about as early as possible.
Right. So since we're on that, what is the preventive medicine for, you know, dementia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's?
Well, the kind of diet that I recommend is sort of a modified Mediterranean diet. And the
Hmm.
reason why I say it's a modified diet is because there's a version of the Mediterranean diet that's described in the nutritional orthodoxy that is actually not all that similar to the actual Mediterranean diet. For some reason, we've described the Mediterranean diet as a grain based diet that includes vegetable oils from grains and seeds like corn and canola oil. Um, and when you actually go to the Mediterranean region of the world and you visit kitchens that are cooking with a more traditional approach, what you'll find is that the only fat that they're using in those kitchens is extra virgin olive oil.
Right.
Maybe occasionally they'll use animal fats like butter. It's not really a grain based diet. It's certainly not a low protein diet.
Hmm.
They eat lots of lamb, uh, other animal, cows, poultry, pork, lots of. I mean, they're. I mean, if you think about some of um, the like the processed meats that we're all so scared of, right? Mortadella, right?
Mm.
Like salami. Those all come from the Mediterranean region of the world where they have reduced rates of Alzheimer's disease, of
Mm.
cardiovascular disease, of cancer. Um,
Mm.
so I started looking at the population level epidemiology, and we see that the Mediterranean dietary pattern is associated with improved odds, right? Reduced risk of developing these kinds of conditions. And then you find randomized control trials like the Finger study, which is being run out of the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, Sweden, where they embrace a diet that's very much like a Mediterranean style diet. Um, you can then look at smaller studies where they uh, will use, for example, they will smaller observational studies where they will look at various food components like red meat, and they'll control for various other factors like um, you know education levels, which can be a risk factor for low education, can be a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And you'll see that the consumption of foods high in, I'll just use as an example, choline, which is most concentrated in animal products like eggs and red meat, is associated with a risk reduction for developing Alzheimer's disease.
Mm.
Um, so I kind of just approached this with an open mind from a 30,000 foot view, and the goal for me was really to find the foods that were going to be the most accessible, the lowest cost, the easiest to spin into delicious recipes that were going to provide people with the most bang for their buck in terms of the nutrients that can help support brain health, can help promote the growth of healthy new brain cells as we age, which we know that the brain can do, um, and that also are going to help facilitate metabolic health, which
Right.
relies on us feeling a sense of satiety from our food. So I kind of took all of those into account, and then I threw into the soup a little bit of sort of the ancestral lens and the precautionary principle, where I believe that the less time a food or a product or a supplement has been in available to humans, with it's the more scrutiny we need to have when assessing whether or not that food has a place in a biologically appropriate diet for people. And I began
Hmm.
there, and happy to tease apart any single food component and expound further if you'd like.
Yeah. Well, so Mediterranean diet, let's bring that to like a listener here who's sitting in their car in Manhattan or LA or Encinitas, which is my neck of the woods. And they say, okay, I like that, Max, but I don't live in Greece. What should I go buy at Whole
Yeah,
Foods tomorrow? You know,
whole plant and animal products.
whole plants
That's
and
r-
animals.
that's really it, Marky Mark. Hope you don't
Yeah.
mind me calling you that. I
You
just
can call me anything you want. You know what I mean? Some people call me Commander. Some people call me Cyborg. Some people call me Mark.
uh,
Marky Mark is kind of cool. I like that.
I like that.
Mark Wahlberg's actually kind of a hero of mine. I want to meet him someday.
Oh, that's cool.
And I wonder how many people, by the way, you got me on a rabbit. I wonder how many people know that Wahlberg was a rapper. You
Yeah,
know, like most people have kind of either forgotten that or they never knew that because it's become such a big star. But
that's true.
anyways, back
That's
to
true.
Whole Foods.
Yeah. Um, So when it comes to brain health, there's really a robust body of literature saying that fish is really good for the brain, medicine for the brain. In fact, people
Yeah.
that have a genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease seem to be protected when they eat 1 to 2 servings of fatty fish a week.
Is that because of the omega-3, or what's the issue there?
Fish are a great source of omega 3s, also a great source of protein.
Hmm.
And salmon in particular is a wonderful source of an antioxidant called astaxanthin, which in particular is very effective at protecting fatty structures in the brain. So
Hmm.
when we're talking about the brain, eye
Hmm.
tissue, which has neural tissue, our eyes are an extension of our brain, skin.
Hmm.
Um, so fish is really great. Also, fish is a natural source of vitamin D, selenium, which we know is an
Hmm.
important
Hmm.
cofactor in many brain related antioxidants. So there's fish. Red meat. I'm a huge fan of, which I mentioned, which is a little bit more controversial, but it's not controversial that red meat is a great source of protein. In fact, animal proteins are the highest quality sources of protein that can be found in nature. They're highly digestible and they're concentrated um, with essential amino acids.
Hmm.
And we know that protein helps to facilitate muscle mass
Hmm.
retention as we get older, which is really important.
Right.
The brain really relies on a body that is mobile.
Hmm.
And when we eat protein, we facilitate a robustness and a strength. In fact, there was a study that came out recently that found that among people who were at high genetic risk for Alzheimer's disease, frailty was a key determinant in terms of whether or not one would actually go on to develop Alzheimer's disease.
Makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. And the research is finally coming out about the body brain connection and how much the brain relies on the movement of blood and the actual bilateral stimulation of walking, running, swimming, climbing. The basic human functions require. The brain needs that to be healthy and thrive.
Absolutely. I mean, when you're sitting sedentary for an extended period of time, blood literally drains from your brain. And
Right.
all it takes is a little bit of movement to help reperfuse the brain.
Hmm.
And exercise, we know, is crucially important for many reasons. And, that's an area that we can spend a whole hour talking about by
Yeah.
itself. But protein helps facilitate that because it bathes your muscles in essential amino acids, namely leucine, which is
Right.
the most important amino acid when it comes to muscle protein synthesis and,
Right.
and halting muscle protein breakdown, which occurs on a more accelerated basis as we get older.
Yeah, red meat. Let's just double click on that for a little bit, because you're right. It is controversial. There is the environmental aspect of the whole big cow industry, creating most of the methane gas. And also then the spiritual component of just how these animals are treated, or the moral
Yes.
component, right? It's just horrific. But at the same time, we're not geared up to feed 8 billion people with local, farms that have 1 to 2 cows like they were, 100 years ago. What do you think? So there's that issue, and I know, like, Rob Wolf is one of the things I love about him is he loves red meat too, but he wants to bring it back to more localized, sustainable, agri. I don't know what you call it, but farming, I guess. And I love that too, but there's a practicality issue there. So setting aside the moral and the environmental issues, I've also heard that red meat is harder to digest.
Hmm.
And so it creates a higher tax on the body than say chicken or fish. Fish being the least. Is that something you've come across in your research?
It can be harder to digest for people that have low stomach acid, which is a problem, especially for
Mm.
the millions of people worldwide that take stomach acid blocking medications like proton pump inhibitors.
Oh, interesting.
We also, I mean, stomach acid tends to decline as we get older, along with protein digesting enzymes like pepsin
Hmm.
and various protease enzymes, which can be supplemented with. Um, but But in general, I mean, meat is usually very well tolerated. Like for people that have GI symptoms, whether it's IBS or whatever, if you inspect your stool, which people should do generally, usually what they'll see is undigested plant material. It's not
Hmm.
undigested animal products. Undigested
Interesting.
animal products are, for anybody that's ever had a colonoscopy. I've never had one, but you're usually advised to eat low residue foods for a time, and meat, eggs, fish, things like that. These are low residue foods, meaning they get absorbed almost entirely in the small intestine because they're so nutrient dense.
Interesting.
People that have like GI issues um, tend to uh, tolerate poorly various plant materials. And
Hmm.
I'm not a carnivore dieter, so I
Hmm.
definitely, and we can talk about my love for fresh fruits and vegetables,
Hmm.
but generally meat should be something that is very well tolerated for some people. There are certain rare cases of meat intolerance. I think Lyme disease. I could be mistaken because it's been a while, but I think Lyme disease can create that kind of sensation in people,
Right.
that symptom. But generally, meat is very well tolerated, and it's because meat provides nutrition that is plug and play for the body, right? Like
Right.
we're animals, and when we ingest components of other animals, we're literally getting nutrients that are plug and play for our biology. Omega 3s, for example, you
They've already
mentioned
been
them.
constructed, right?
Yeah,
Whereas with the plant proteins, they have to be constructed to meet the needs of the
there you
animal
go.
biology.
Yeah, 100%. It's a different operating system.
That's right. That's fascinating.
Um, for example, omega 3s derived from plants, alpha linolenic acid that you'll get from walnuts or chia seeds or flax seeds have to undergo those omega 3s have to undergo complex biochemical transformation before they become the form that's utilized in our body,
Hmm.
utilized in our brains to create healthy new brain cells, right?
Hmm.
And the efficacy of those processes differ from person to person. Some genders, for example, women are better at it than men.
Hmm.
People of darker complexion are better at it than people of more fair skin complexion.
Interesting.
But if you're a white male, chances are you're not deriving any nutritional value from plant forms of omega 3s. You could be consuming all the flaxseed oil you want, and it's not enriching your brain at all with DHA. And so
Right.
for you and me, that might just be extra calories,
Right.
which who needs, right?
Who needs, right?
So
That is
that's just
fascinating.
one example.
Yeah, no, that's the first time I've ever heard that stated that way. But it's just obvious once it's out there, right? That animal proteins are building blocks that have more complexity than plant proteins, and so they're ready to plug and play.
Yeah, I mean, some of us have evolved because humans are highly adaptable. So some of us
Right.
have evolved the capability, depending on where our lineage derives from, to convert these plant based forms of nutrients to their usable form in the body. And it depends nutrient to nutrient, right? So
Yeah.
vitamin C, for example, is predominantly found in plants, and we're all very good at at utilizing ascorbic acid. But beta carotene is another example of a plant based nutrient. It's called provitamin A. Some of us are really good at converting beta carotene to vitamin A, but some of us are not as good
Hmm.
at it.
Hmm.
One of my favorite nutrition researchers, Chris Masterjohn, has talked a lot about this. And so for people who are not really good at converting beta carotene to vitamin A, retinol, which is the active animal derived form of vitamin A, might be a better choice. And you can find retinol easily in foods like liver, um, eggs, grass fed butter, and stuff like that.
Hmm. That's interesting. What if I were to? Let me just think about this question for a second. What would be the impact on my health, if any, if I just gorged on Ralph's USDA red beef versus a Whole Foods grass-fed Wagyu?
Oh man, such a good question and thought experiment, really.
Yeah.
Well, we know that first of all, we know that cows are extremely fatty animals, especially in comparison to wild game.
Hmm.
So a modern cow is actually a very fatty animal, and a
Hmm.
grain finished cow is much fattier than a grass finished
Hmm.
cow. So I would say that if you're regularly eating very fatty meat, you're probably going to see your LDL lipoproteins go up,
Hmm.
which I'm not an advocate of driving LDL as low as possible, um, but a cow that's fed its biologically appropriate diet, the fact that a cow that eats grass is going to have less saturated fat in its fat and be a leaner animal overall, to me that tells me something about the relative ratio in which we're supposed to eat these kinds of animal fats. To eat a very fatty uh, cow to me that's been grain finished is evolutionarily inconsistent.
Right.
Um, because we hunted wild game, we ate from the sea, and so we see, thanks to research, that a grass finished cow is going to have um, a higher proportion of omega-3 fatty acids. It's going to have more monounsaturated fat, which we know is very good for our cardiovascular system. And even the saturated fat that it has is going to be better for us, because not all saturated fats are created equally.
Hmm.
Different foods have different types of saturated fatty acids. There is myristic acid, palmitic
Hmm.
acid. Both of those have been associated with increasing levels of LDL. But then there's another saturated fat that's found in abundance in dark chocolate, and it's found in a higher proportion in grass finished beef, called stearic acid,
Hmm.
that has no impact on LDL cholesterol, and it's actually been shown to boost uh, mitochondrial function, which mitochondria are the energy producing organelles of cells. It's like where metabolism actually occurs. And so a fat is not a fat is not a fat. Beef
Hmm.
is not beef is not beef, right?
Hmm.
Um, a little bit here and there certainly won't kill you. If all I had access to were grain finished cuts of meat, I would just go for leaner cuts,
Yeah.
because what a cow eats really dictates the nutritional value of its fat.
Right.
So a filet mignon from a grain finished cow to a grass finished cow, probably going to be no nutritional difference. But
Really?
if we're
Okay.
talking about like a ribeye, for example, or
With
a
a lot of
fattier
fat. Yeah.
cut of meat, yeah, then you're going to see a major nutritional difference
I
between
didn't know
a
that.
yeah.
So let's talk about, let's say I do get a ribeye. In the old days, when fat was bad, I would cut off all the fat, right? Just to eat whatever was red. Is that a bad idea? I mean, fat, we need the fat, right? The fat's good for us, assuming it's good fat.
Yeah, we absolutely, I mean, we definitely need fat. It's an essential nutrient. And people who are on low fat and low saturated fat diets seem to see a reduction in testosterone. So
Hmm.
I'm certainly not demonizing animal fat here. Uh, I think that there's a point at which uh, animal fat can, as I mentioned, cause problems if we're eating too much of it.
Hmm.
Um,
And too much of the wrong kind, the grain
yeah,
finished. Yeah.
too much of the wrong kind. Now, what I want people to take from this is that dose matters, and at the end of the day, the benefits of eating meat, I think, outweigh the risks, because
Right.
meat is a very nutrient dense product. It provides fat soluble antioxidants, which can help protect the brain as it ages. Amazing source of dietary protein, a pristine source of highly bioavailable dietary protein, high quality, the best protein that you'll find in nature, as I've mentioned. Um, Unique carnonutrients like creatine, which can, being in fitness, I'm sure you're familiar with creatine as a
Hmm.
sports performance boosting supplement, but it's
Hmm.
also a really important nutrient for brain energy metabolism.
Hmm.
And studies show that when you take vegans and vegetarians who don't regularly consume meat, obviously, and you give them supplemental creatine, they see an improvement in their cognitive function. So I think that some meat is without question better than none.
Hmm.
But if we're talking about especially making recommendations en masse, like, do I think that eating excessively fatty meat all the time is good for you? No, I don't think so. Also because our meat is different, as I mentioned. It's got, it has less omega threes, more of the quote unquote unhealthy saturated fats. Um, but again, I think that the benefits generally outweigh the risks, and that some is better than none.
I
That's my take.
reckon saw that you recommended 50 grams of protein for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. That sounds like a lot of protein to me.
It's a
I'm not
lot.
sure how it's like a two or three fistful of protein.
Yeah.
How do we get that? Like, what's your prescription for getting, and why? Like, why that
Yeah.
much protein?
So I tried to clarify in the caption of that post. You're referring to an Instagram post that I made.
Right, right.
Really, you don't need to get 50 grams at each meal. However, for exercising individuals, the data suggests that you should strive to get zero point 0.7 grams of protein per pound of lean mass. Now, most people don't know how much lean mass they have. So if you're lean, use your body weight, and if you're not lean, use your goal weight and multiply it by zero point 0.7. And that's roughly how many grams of protein that you should be getting every day to support um, not
Yeah,
just muscle mass retention, but muscle protein synthesis. So if you do the math,
I got to do the math right now. Let's see.
let's
Point
figure it out. I'll do it with you.
0.7 times 190. I'm kind of a lean 190. I'll say 190. It's 133 grams.
Yeah,
Damn.
that's generally what mine is. Mine is about 130 grams. So, you know, if you
I don't
break
think
that
I'm
up,
getting anywhere near close to that, Max. I don't. That's interesting.
well,
Although I don't feel deprived.
you don't feel deprived.
I
You're
don't. Maybe I don't
you're
know how to tell.
you're not at risk of protein deficiency. I
Okay.
mean, that's certainly true. But if you're looking to optimize your quote unquote gains in the gym, there's
Yeah.
a great meta analysis by Alan Aragon. He's one of the authors. I think the co author was Brad Schoenfeld. They're both
Yeah.
exercise physiologists and nutrition science with a specific focus on maximizing hypertrophy, body composition, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it really seems to be double the RDA. So the recommendation that I made, zero point 0.7 grams per pound of lean mass on a daily basis, that really can help optimize muscle mass retention, particularly
Mm-hmm.
as we get older. Because as we get older, we also experience something called anabolic resistance, which makes getting high quality protein regularly at every meal on a daily basis even more crucial because it gets harder and harder to maintain that mass. So for me, it's like I'm trying to get 30 to 40 grams of protein in at each meal.
Mm-hmm.
I'll take a protein shake over the course of the day at some point, and if I'm snacking, I'll snack on higher protein foods like
Mm-hmm.
uh, like beef jerky and stuff like that. If you're not actively working out, if you're not on a weight training regimen, you could eat a little bit less.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't done the math to do the conversion between kilograms to grams. Um, from kilograms to pounds, but it's 1.2 grams of protein for every 1.2 kilograms of lean mass. If you're not on a weight training regimen, but in either scenario, that's more than what the RDA is for protein,
Mm-hmm.
which is about half of that. It's zero point 0.8 grams per kilogram
Yeah, because
of
they've got
mass.
to leave room for all the sugar that they recommend.
There you go. Your average American consumes 77 grams of added sugar every single day,
That's insane.
which is like 20 teaspoons of pure sugar.
That's really a stat. 20
Yeah,
teaspoons of sugar. People are the average American.
of 20 teaspoons of added sugar. This is sugar for which we have no biological necessity, and it's in all the packaged processed junk
Yeah.
that your average American is eating. Sugar sweetened beverages and things like that.
Yeah. All right, let's pivot just for a very, very short time because I think the gig is up on sugar, even though the FDA seems to haven't gotten the news yet, having refused to, against the recommendation of their own staff, refused to change the RDA on sugar last year, which shows you that there's someone's taken a lot of money from the packaged food industry over there.
Mm.
You know, corruption runs in our government, though it seems to be hidden. It's a little bit more opaque these days. Anyways, I went off on a little tangent there because it pisses me off, by the way,
Yeah,
that the government is recommending, added sugar or excess sugar because sugar is freaking poison, right? It's really bad for you. And like you said, you need a little bit of natural sources of sugar like fructose, but what is 20 grams of sugar doing to somebody if they're eating it
it's
down?
it's a good question. I mean, it depends on what your context is everything in nutrition, right? So for a population that is by and large metabolically ill and morbidly overweight, recommending 10% of your calories still being able to come from added sugar to me is a massive public disservice.
Yeah, I
Now,
agree.
if you are a bodybuilder and you have a massive calorie budget and you're active all day and you're working out twice a day, can you have a little bit of added sugar in your diet and see no health consequence whatsoever? Yeah, of course. So
Hmm.
everybody's different at the end of the day, but by and large, we're sedentary, we're metabolically unwell, and added sugar is just empty calories with
Hmm.
no nutritional value, and there's no need for it. So that's on top of the recommended amount of grains that Americans are still being told to consume every day, depending on calorie needs. The
Hmm.
USDA still recommends, because they use the my plate paradigm, still recommends that you can consume up to that you should consume up to 10 servings of grains a day, up to half of which may be refined. So that's a serving is a slice of bread.
Hmm.
according to the USDA. So they're still recommending to people based on calorie needs that you can eat up to 10 slices of bread a day, with up to half of those being white bread. I don't eat 10 slices of bread in a year.
Yeah,
Like,
right.
it's just it's mind blowing to me that that's still what they're recommending. On top of the up to 10% of your calories coming from sugar. So it's mind blowing, and that's no wonder why. I mean, just harking back to what we talked about earlier, why people are so confused when it comes to nutrition.
God, I would love to go down that rabbit hole a little bit further about why that happens, but it's not the focus of this podcast, right? Yeah, it's crazy though. But what about the insulin impact of sugar? Because it's not just empty calories; it has an effect on your hormonal balance, doesn't it? And it can
Yeah,
really upset the balance over time.
yeah. I mean, so sugar, starchy carbohydrates, any glucose yielding carbohydrate is going to cause an elevation of the hormone insulin, which it plays a few roles in the body. It helps to partition energy, so it helps to make sure that whenever it's elevated, you're not utilizing any of your precious fat stores,
Hmm.
and whatever fat you are consuming is being stored. So it
Hmm.
helps to store fat, and it also helps to make sure that because we're storing fat, um, we still need energy, right? That we're burning primarily carbohydrates as an
Hmm.
energy source. So whenever insulin is elevated, your fat cells become a one-way valve, so calories can flow in, but they can't come out. And and it also makes sure that you're burning primarily carbohydrates.
Hmm.
Chronically elevated insulin is a major problem. It precedes prediabetes. It precedes type 2 diabetes. So you really want to be mindful of keeping your insulin low. As I mentioned, on 24 hours of a low carbohydrate diet, your insulin is halved. So
Hmm.
I think that's important. When it comes to the brain, 40% of Alzheimer's cases might be attributable to chronically elevated insulin.
Really? Wow.
So yeah, there was a research paper published. I forget the journal that it was published in, but the researcher was Melissa Schilling, who's an NYU professor, and she looked at the role that insulin plays in metabolic signaling, and the Alzheimer's disease is now being considered type 3 diabetes.
Hmm.
In the brain, you sort of see what you get with both type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. So in type 1 diabetes, there's a deficit of insulin because the insulin producing beta cells of the pancreas are being killed off by the host's immune system. And then in type 2 diabetes, you've got lots of insulin, but the patient has become essentially insulin resistant. And so in the brain, you have insulin resistance and you have insulin deficiency.
Hmm.
And so um, one of the major, I think, ways to preserve the insulin sensitivity of the brain is to make sure that your body is metabolically healthy.
Hmm.
And the way to do that, the way to promote metabolic health is to, I think, biologically appropriate diet, don't become overweight, and keep your insulin and not eat so many carbohydrates that your insulin is chronically elevated over the course of the day.
Hmm.
Insulin also interferes with the brain's ability to clean itself because when we sleep, we a network in the brain called the glymphatic system helps flush proteins like beta amyloid and tau out, and it utilizes an enzyme called insulin degrading enzyme to keep amyloid soluble. But as its name suggests, insulin degrading enzyme also degrades insulin. And when insulin is around, all insulin degrading enzyme is going to do, it's going to focus on the insulin.
Hmm.
So that's one reason why I think it's really important to not eat too close to bedtime
Right.
so that your body can rest and digest and repair ultimately uh, without the interference of having elevated insulin levels.
Hmm. Shift a moment to heart health. Are there any issues around eating too much meat or red meat or getting too much meat protein on the heart?
Great question. With regard to protein, no. I'm not concerned about animal protein with regard to cardiovascular health. In fact, because protein is so important in terms of keeping you metabolically healthy, because it helps fortify your musculature.
Hmm.
I think that protein can play a cardioprotective role there.
Interesting.
It helps facilitate exercise.
Okay.
As I mentioned, I do think that eating excessively fatty meat, insofar as it can drive LDL up, it can increase levels of ApoB, which is um, actually now being looked at as a more sensitive predictor of cardiovascular risk.
Hmm.
Eating excessively fatty grain-fed meat can certainly do that, but it's not just the meat. And again, the benefits of eating meat, I think, outweigh the risks. It's, are you also metabolically healthy otherwise? Are your levels of inflammation low? Are you eating, in general, a diet that has healthful fats in it, as opposed to corn oil, canola oil, soybean oil?
Hmm.
Are you eating adequate dietary fiber? We know that when you eat dietary fiber, certain types of dietary fiber, it actually helps trap cholesterol in the gut, which you then eliminate when you go number two.
Hmm.
And so fiber can actually help with LDL recycling,
Interesting.
which is really important. So uh, I'm not concerned with, you know, with a uh, with the consumption of the consumption of red meat in the context of a diet that has, ample fiber and phytochemicals, phytonutrients in it. Um, it's not a concern for me.
Okay. So, in general, I keep hearing over the years that coffee and alcohol in limited quantities aren't bad for you, and actually a little bit might be good for you. What's your take on coffee and alcohol in a diet?
Yeah, I love this. Coffee's actually, I mean, observationally, coffee, I really love coffee, but I find it also very useful to abstain from coffee
Mm.
for periods to resensitize my brain to it. Because the thing about
Right.
coffee is that you are not creating energy from thin air when you drink coffee. You're basically
Right.
borrowing that energy from later. And once we develop a dependence on caffeine, I think it leaves us more prone to experiencing that wired and tired feeling, and also feeling like we were hit by a train later on in the afternoon,
Right.
right? But there are some benefits to coffee. Like coffee, it's America's number one source of dietary polyphenols, which are basically plant compounds that we know are really good for us.
Hmm.
Um, Coffee helps to stimulate detox pathways in the body. It was also recently shown, I mean, you were just asking me about cardiovascular health, that caffeine in the body functions very much like a new class of cholesterol lowering drugs called PCSK9 inhibitors
Hmm.
that basically help the liver become better at recycling cholesterol. So, coffee can play, I think, a really great cardio and neuroprotective role, provided you're not drinking too much of it and it's not negatively affecting your sleep.
Hmm.
But some tips that I'll offer people for coffee consumption, that actually, this tip is pretty mind blowing. Most people are unaware of this connection, but you want to make sure that if you drink coffee, especially if you're prone to, or if you have high cholesterol levels, that you're running your coffee through a paper filter. So I just dropped a pen. So drip coffee is great. Using a pour over system, really good. The problem with French presses, and I used to be a big French press user for a long time, is that um, it allows for a compound in coffee called cafestol to make it into your cup. And cafestol is almost completely absorbed by a paper filter,
Hmm.
but you're not absorbing that compound with a French press. And that compound has been shown to be a very powerful um, uh, elevator of LDL
Interesting.
cholesterol. Yeah, and
What about
I'm not.
the Keurig and that type of thing, which are really popular, or Nespresso? Do you get any of that stuff filtered out with those?
You don't, because they don't run it through a paper filter. And in fact, I know I'm gonna make some enemies here. If anybody has one of these who's listening, but I'm actually concerned that you're running hot water through those little plastic cartridges,
Yeah. Right.
and so that's actually exposing you to plasticizing compounds, which we know are endocrine disruptors,
Right.
which can they essentially act like estrogen in the body. So
Interesting.
yeah, so I'm not a fan of those
I
creations.
used one of those, I've got to admit, until I gave it up recently. Mainly for its freaking convenience, right? Because
Yeah, they're so
push the
convenient.
button and you're out the door. I got to admit that was it. But I stopped. drinking coffee altogether when I started drinking mud water, which is a mushroom based drink and has a little bit of caffeine, 7%, 7/10, I guess, of the caffeine from chai. And honestly, I wasn't, Max, trying to give up coffee because I loved it. But within like a week or two of drinking the mud water, I just stopped drinking coffee. I really had lost all my desire for it, and I love the mud water. In fact, that's what I have in this cup right here.
That's awesome.
Anyway, so it'd be interesting for you to take a look at that. It's got like 7 different mushrooms in it. But then, because the reason I brought that up is I still feel like there's health benefits to some coffee. So I've been drinking, like a cappuccino on the weekends just to kind of, feel it. But I don't have a need for it every day, do I? Or what's the frequency of coffee use to
Yeah.
get some of the health benefits?
Well, people who drink more coffee seem to be protected against Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis,
Interesting.
cardiovascular disease. So
But
I'm
does it have to be coffee, or is it the caffeine? Can you get that from green tea and from mud water, or does it have to be
It's not. I
caffeine
mean,
based?
caffeine, as I mentioned, has benefits but I think it's primarily, and green tea has benefits too,
Right.
actually. But I think it's the plant compounds in the coffee
Interesting.
um, that are at least in part responsible for that effect that we're seeing.
Right.
So I'm a
How
fan
much
of
is too
coffee.
much, though? How much is too much?
I think it depends. I think if you're dependent on it, because here's the deal: like when you had your first cup of coffee, you probably experienced mental clarity, mental acuity, and even physical performance that
Right.
was well above your baseline performance, right? With that
Right.
first cup. Today, what happens when we drink, when we become dependent on coffee and we drink it day in and day out, we're actually not experiencing a level of performance above our baseline. We're actually drinking that so that we can get back to our baseline because we're in withdrawal from coffee. And so,
Hmm.
with every cup of coffee, we're just treating our withdrawal from yesterday.
Interesting. Yeah.
And so, that's not, I think, a good position to be in. That's why I recommend taking routine breaks from coffee and
Yeah.
switching to decaf and then bringing it back. If coffee is negatively interfering with your sleep, that's a big problem. You want to make sure that you're drinking, that you're curtailing your caffeine consumption um, to about noon generally.
Hmm. Yeah.
This depends ultimately on genes. Some people are slow metabolizers of caffeine, and some are fast metabolizers. And then the other, I guess, the final point that I would make about coffee is that aside from the obvious, you want to make sure that you're not adding too much sugar, if any, because most coffee drinks are actually desserts.
Hmm.
Uh, but um, but I think it's smart not to drink it as soon as you wake up, because when you wake up, we have what's called a diurnal cortisol pattern.
Hmm.
That means that our body's natural caffeine, our own endogenous, our own innate source of caffeine, which is cortisol, is elevated for the first 45 minutes to an hour after we wake up. It's the body's
Hmm.
waking hormone,
Hmm.
essentially. And coffee can also cause a spike in cortisol. And so I think it's smart um, to wait at least 45 minutes to an hour after you wake up to have your first cup of Joe,
I could
which I
tell
know
you,
is hard.
everyone listening to this is going to say, "Yeah, Max, I love all your other recommendations, but that one, screw you, I'm throwing that one out
Yeah.
because I got to have my coffee when I wake up."
Well, anecdotally, when I drink it first thing in the morning, I find myself in the afternoon more inclined to feeling that sensation of like I've been hit by a train.
Hmm.
What the way that coffee works is it blocks adenosine receptors,
Hmm.
and adenosine doesn't start to build up in the brain until later on in the day.
Hmm.
So there's really no physiologic reason why anybody would need coffee first thing in the morning. It's just a dependency thing. And
Yes,
coffee, it's a
better to get out of
psychoactive.
bed, get some fresh sunlight, and do some burpees, and then have your
Exactly.
coffee 45 minutes later. Yeah.
Well said. Well said. It's a psychoactive drug, and most people don't treat it as such. We treat it almost as a vitamin. And I think that we need to. I think we should reframe the relationship that we have with coffee, because it's an amazing beverage. It's an amazing drug, right?
Right.
But we want it to work for us, not against us.
Right.
So that's all that I would add to that.
We're running out of time here, but what about alcohol? Because I see all these studies that say, yeah, a little bit of alcohol is good for you, but you know, it doesn't seem that good for you from my perspective. I quit drinking it altogether, but it took me a while to get there because we have, my family tended to like alcohol, so we started drinking it pretty young, and the Navy kind of perpetuated that, right? So, at any
Oh
rate,
man.
you know, it felt like one of those things that kind of robbed me of energy, almost like what you were talking about with coffee. Even if you just had a glass of wine or something. What's your take on
Yeah.
alcohol consumption?
I mean, I drink occasionally. I have, I'll have like 2 to 3 drinks a month, pretty much, and that's because
That's a very light drinker, by the way.
very
I
light
think
drinker. I'm
that's
a very
great.
light
Yeah.
drinker. Yeah. Here's the thing. Research shows that drinking in moderation is associated with health benefits,
Mm,
but researchers haven't really been able to reconcile that observation with the fact that ethanol is a neurotoxin and a carcinogen.
right.
And so, what I think we're seeing with that observation that moderate drinkers seem to have better health, it's really that the ability to be moderate is
Yeah.
something that's beneficial from a health standpoint. If you're
Right.
able
So you're
to
moderate in that, then you're going to be moderate in coffee. You're going to be moderate in your diet. In other words, like,
exactly,
yeah.
this is called, Mark, the healthy user effect,
Right.
and we see it in with a lot of different foods. We see it with whole grains. We see
Hmm.
it with vegetables. People that eat whole grains seem to have better health, but the question is always: is it because of the grains, or is it in spite of the grains?
Hmm.
Somebody who routinely eats a highfalutin grain like quinoa. I mean, the fact that they can pronounce quinoa is is impressive enough, right?
Right.
But if they're regularly eating out, especially when you know how the average American eats these days, again,
Right.
60% of calories coming from ultra processed foods. If you take somebody and they're regularly eating quinoa, chances are the odds are pretty high that that person is also, I don't know, taking a multivitamin, working out on a regular basis, drinking water instead of soda regularly.
Hmm.
So that's why observational level evidence is continually confounded by other variables because of this healthy user bias. This is why nutrition research is so difficult to do. And it's also the reason, coincidentally, why meat consumption is seemingly always associated with negative health outcomes,
Hmm.
because observationally you see the people who eat more meat tend to smoke more, they tend to be more sedentary. God forbid we look at processed meat, right? Where does processed meat fit into the standard American diet? It's hot dogs, it's
Right.
Subway sandwiches, it's the fries that come with the fast food and the soda and all that stuff. So healthy user bias is a major wrench in the equation of nutrition science. But
Hmm.
going back to your question of alcohol, I think it is possible to drink responsibly. You just want to make sure that you're hydrating well and that you go to sleep sober, because alcohol, I think one of the most damaging things that alcohol can do is it affects your sleep negatively.
Right. Right.
It helps you get to sleep faster, but it degrades the quality of your sleep. And both sleep duration and sleep quality are both really important when it comes to preventive health.
Yeah. Well said. You shouldn't eat or drink 2 hours before bed as a general rule, right?
That's a solid rule. I mean,
Yeah.
if you do that, um, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of good research now showing that that's beneficial.
Tell us about your book, Genius Kitchen.
So, Genius Kitchen is a two-in-one book. It's both a cookbook that I'm super excited about, featuring the most accessible, affordable, and nutrient-dense foods in the modern supermarket. But it's
Hmm.
also a kitchen and wellness guide. So much of
Nice.
what we've talked about here today, I do an even deeper dive in the book. And really, it's about making all of the recommendations actionable and achievable for most
Hmm.
people. So um, it's a beautiful book. We got lots of gorgeous photos in it, but it's highly actionable. Lots of really great advice: how to minimize exposure to toxins in your kitchen, how to improve digestion.
Nice.
Um, we talked a little bit about optimizing for stomach acid, right? So
Hmm.
if you're not digesting your food properly, you're shortchanging the ability of your food to protect your brain, to protect your health, to protect your heart,
Hmm.
and you're wasting a lot of money in the process. So
Hmm.
yeah, so it's a two-in-one resource and cookbook that I think people are really going to like, and it's called Genius Kitchen.
And where could someone get a copy of that book, or is it on pre-order now? Or I'm not sure if pre-order would be on um, when this podcast comes out, but when's it
Yeah,
coming out, and what's the plan?
well, it comes out March 29th, so
Okay.
you can, if you're listening to this before then, you can pre-order at geniuskitchenbook.com,
Okay.
where you'll find all the links to all the different stores. And if this is you're listening to this after March 29th, well, the book is available still at geniuskitchenbook.com. You'll find all the links, but it's available at every major bookstore.
Got it. And your website is maxlugavere.com, Lugavere.com for those in their car. Social media, where can someone track you there?
Super active on Instagram at Max Lugavere,
Okay,
Lugavere. And then I host my own podcast as well called The Genius Life. So if you're interested in
nice.
podcasts, check it out.
Yeah, well, I'd love to be a guest on that.
Yeah, of
I don't
course.
know much about nutrition though.
Well,
Everything I know about nutrition, I just learned.
we love Navy SEALs. So
Awesome. Yeah, let's do
yeah,
that, Max.
yeah,
Thanks so
for
much
sure.
for your time today. Really nice to meet you. I appreciate your time. I appreciate all the work you're doing, and you're a lot of fun. You got great knowledge, so keep doing what you're doing. If
Thank
I
you,
can
Marky
help you out,
Mark.
if I can help you out anyway, I'm just down the road from you.
Awesome, brother. Well, appreciate it, and really glad to get to know you. And thank you. It's
Yeah,
been a pleasure.
and you're the only one who gets to call me Marky Mark.
I
Not many
love it.
people would call Mark Divine the Navy SEAL Marky Mark, but you get to. You've earned the right, buddy.
Thank you.
All right, take care. Thanks again.